The American frontier was more than dusty trails, gunfights, and Hollywood legends. Behind the myths lies a world of curious details, surprising truths, and little-known stories that shaped the Old West. From the hats cowboys really wore to the daily lives of pioneers, these facts will make you see the Wild West in a whole new way. What's your favorite piece of Old West trivia? Leave a comment below and share your thoughts. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you never miss another journey into frontier history. Folklore says Judge Roy Bean once became entangled in a dispute over a young woman in California that led to a fatal outcome for a Mexican official. Another oft-repeated tale claims Bean was nearly executed in retaliation, only to be rescued by the woman at the center of the dispute. Afterward, he was said to have lingering neck trouble. These episodes are part of Bean's legend and are not fully verified by contemporary records. In 1832, Jose Ortiz is credited with an early gold discovery south of Santa Fe, New Mexico, helping spark a brief boom around the settlement known as Dolores. Many historians note this as one of the earliest significant gold finds in the American West. Established in 1827, Fort Leavenworth in Kansas remains the oldest continuously operating U.S. Army post west of the Mississippi River. In 1953, near Midland, Texas, researchers found ancient human remains, often called the Midland remains, believed to belong to an adult woman roughly 11,000 years old, making them among the oldest in the Western Hemisphere. The phrase red light district is commonly linked to Dodge City, Kansas. One popular explanation points to a local bordello with a red glass front door that cast a glow at night, and the name later spread to the town's brothel area. A physician's report once characterized Clay Allison as exhibiting unstable behavior, noting that emotional or physical excitement could bring on intense episodes. A period description that reflected concerns about his temperament. Scholarly estimates for the indigenous population of North America prior to widespread European settlement vary widely, from around 8.4 million to well over 100 million. Those peoples organized into hundreds of distinct nations, often summarized as about 240 tribal groupings, speaking roughly 300 languages. After large-scale bison hunts between about 1870 and 1883, bones scattered across the Great Plains were purchased by Eastern companies for fertilizer and for making bone china. Bone pickers could earn about $8 per ton collected. Around 1541, the region now known as Texas was recorded as Teyas, a Spanish rendering of a Caddo term often translated as allies or friends. On May 8, 1871, Wyatt Earp was indicted for horse theft in Van Buren, Arkansas. Rather than face trial, he forfeited bail and made his way to Kansas, where his life took a new direction. One enduring legend says that the practice of spreading sawdust on saloon floors began in Deadwood, South Dakota. According to the story, gold dust often slipped to the floor, and sawdust helped conceal it until the end of the night, when the sweepings could be collected. While colorful, historians note that sawdust was also commonly used simply to absorb spills and reduce mess in busy drinking halls. After more than 2 decades in prison, former outlaw Cole Younger transitioned into quieter pursuits. He sold tombstones for a living, briefly joined Frank James in a Wild West show, and eventually passed away in 1916 at Lee's Summit, Missouri. Remembered by many as a church-going elder rather than an infamous bandit. At the famous OK Corral gunfight, Wyatt Earp was not the official marshal or sheriff of Tombstone. That position belonged to his brother Virgil, who held the title of town marshal. On the day of the clash, Virgil deputized Wyatt, Morgan Earp, and Doc Holliday to support him. The Oregon Trail stretched some 2,020 miles, running from Independence, Missouri, to Fort Vancouver in present-day Washington. Roughly 350,000 immigrants undertook the journey, though not all survived. Historians estimate that 1 in 17 travelers perished, with cholera being the leading cause of death. Harry Longabaugh earned the nickname Sundance Kid after serving time in Sundance, Wyoming, for stealing a horse. The name stuck with him for life and became central to his legend as a member of the Wild Bunch. Another frontier character, Mike Fink, gained fame as a keelboat man along the Ohio and Mississippi rivers. Known for his marksmanship and love of strong drink, he became the subject of tall tales. Though stories of his final days differ, his legend persisted in American folklore, alongside figures such as Paul Bunyan and Pecos Bill. Finally, Texas recorded more gunfights than any other state during the frontier era. Between the 1850s and 1890s, historians estimate around 160 such encounters, underscoring the state's reputation as a hotbed of frontier conflict. Introduced in 1873, the Colt Single Action Army, popularly nicknamed the Peacemaker, was a .45 caliber revolver produced in Hartford, Connecticut. Contemporary pricing hovered around $17. For health and restorative reasons, Theodore Roosevelt spent time in the Dakota Territory, where he developed a deep attachment to ranch life. Before becoming U.S. president, he published Ranch Life and the Hunting Trail, with illustrations by famed Western artist Frederick Remington. In 1862, Samuel Clemens tried prospecting near Unionville, Nevada, during the Silver Excitement. Finding more success trading claims than extracting ore, he moved on, soon adopting the pen name Mark Twain and becoming a pillar of American literature. On December 21, 1876, an incident at the Olympic Dance Hall in Los Animas, Colorado, left Deputy Sheriff Charles Faber dead following a dispute involving Clay Allison. Reports even noted Allison's habit of stepping on other dancers' feet that night. The Dalton Gang's period of major activity was brief, from a train holdup at Wharton, Oklahoma, May 9, 1891, to the Coffeyville, Kansas affair, October 5, 1892, about 1 year and 5 months. Though "stick 'em up" is a staple of Western dialogue, the phrase rose to prominence decades later, especially through 1930s cinema. Earlier uses exist, but the movies cemented it. Mid-1850s Los Angeles had a reputation for extreme lawlessness, with contemporary accounts claiming near-daily fatal incidents. In one Notorious episode, the city's mayor resigned temporarily to lead a vigilante action that removed a prisoner from jail. Period reporting also reflects the era's ethnic tensions surrounding the event. Topeka, Kansas, gained a reputation for frequent armed disputes in its early days. The most unusual episode unfolded inside the Kansas House of Representatives, when Boston Corbett, best known as the man credited with killing John Wilkes Booth, created a disturbance over delayed legislation. He ultimately gave up his sidearm without anyone being harmed and was later committed to the state asylum. During Tombstone, Arizona's boom years, roughly 1878 to 1886, the mines produced about $80 million in silver, fueling one of the Southwest's great rushes. Jesse James was killed in St. Joseph, Missouri, on April 3, 1882, by Bob Ford, who had posed as a friend. Because James was facing away when it happened, Ford was widely condemned as a coward. A decade later, Ford himself died in Creede, Colorado. Before turning to outlaw reputations, Dalton brothers Grat, Bob, and Emmett each wore a badge, serving in law enforcement before crossing to the other side of the law. "Boys, I've found a gold mine." With those famous words attributed to James W. Marshall, his 1848 discovery at a sawmill on the American River, Sutter's Mill, ignited the California gold rush. The Goodnight Loving Trail opened in 1866, linking Fort Belknap, Texas, to Fort Sumner, New Mexico, as a major cattle route. Oliver Loving later succumbed to injuries sustained on the trail, while his partner Charles Goodnight lived into his 90s and died a prosperous man in 1929. On September 26, 1879, Deadwood in Dakota Territory suffered a catastrophic fire that destroyed much of the town. Sawmill owner John Hunter provided enough lumber to rebuild nearly all of Main and Sherman Streets. Many noted frontier shootists met their ends in places where armed confrontations were most common, particularly Texas, Kansas, New Mexico, Oklahoma, California, Missouri, and Colorado. On November 24, 1835, the Republic of Texas created a frontier force that became known as the Texas Rangers. Each ranger was paid $1.25 per day. Their reputation was captured in a popular saying of the time, that they could ride like a Mexican, shoot like a Kentuckian, and fight with unmatched determination. Jack Slade, a well-known figure of the frontier, became infamous for his temper and harsh reputation. Stories about him, particularly from Cold Springs, Colorado, in 1869, describe incidents that contributed to his notoriety. Many of these accounts were passed along by travelers and newspapers, often exaggerated, which helped shape Slade's image as a dangerous man of the Old West. Judge Isaac Parker of Fort Smith, Arkansas, often remembered as the hanging judge, served for 21 years. During his tenure, he issued 160 capital sentences for crimes such as murder and rape. Out of those, 79 men were ultimately executed. Importantly, Parker did not conduct the executions himself. He handed down the sentences as the presiding judge, while the legal system carried out the punishment. On September 8, 1883, Lakota leader Sitting Bull attended the ceremony marking the completion of the Northern Pacific Railroad, linking it to the transcontinental system. A translator had prepared a welcoming speech for him, but Sitting Bull chose to deliver his own address in the Lakota language. While his remarks were sharply critical of U.S. policies toward his people, the audience, unaware of the real content, believed he was offering praise. He even paused for applause, bowed, and smiled as the translator delivered the original scripted version. The Long Branch Saloon, one of Dodge City's most famous establishments, was named by its part owner, William Harris, who had once lived in Long Branch, New Jersey. Built in the 1880s, the saloon became a gathering place for townsfolk and travelers alike. Today, a reconstruction of the Long Branch Saloon can still be seen at Dodge City's Boot Hill Museum, preserving its legacy as a symbol of frontier life. The Pony Express was short-lived, operating only 19 months from April 1860 to October 1861. In that brief span, riders carried nearly 35,000 pieces of mail, covering more than 650,000 miles across rugged terrain. Remarkably, only a single mail pouch was ever reported lost. Riders were typically young, often around 19 years old, and earned $100 to $150 per month, plus food and lodging, a considerable wage for the time. Blackjack Ketchum remains notable in Union County, New Mexico, as the only person executed there. Records of American jurisprudence note that his case was unique. The execution resulted in decapitation, something almost never recorded in U.S. history. The only similar documented case dates back to England in 1601. The famous shootout at the OK Corral in Tombstone lasted much shorter than popular legend suggests, about 30 seconds in total. Despite its brevity, the event became one of the most iconic moments of the Wild West. Mattie Earp, Wyatt Earp's common-law wife during his time in Tombstone, lived a troubled life after their separation. On July 3, 1888, in Pinal, Arizona, she died from an overdose of laudanum. Reports suggest she had become despondent after Wyatt left her for another woman, highlighting the often overlooked personal struggles behind the legends of frontier figures. In 1884, residents of Montana Territory, frustrated with widespread theft and disorder, organized vigilante groups. That year alone, 35 horse and cattle thieves were executed by these citizen enforcers, reflecting the challenges of establishing law and order in frontier communities. Belle Starr, later called the Outlaw Queen, was tried before Judge Isaac Parker in Fort Smith, Arkansas. She was convicted of horse theft and served 5 months in prison, making her the first woman sentenced for a major crime in Parker's court. Starr's life ended abruptly in 1889 when she was shot by an unknown assailant, a mystery that remains unsolved. James Butler Wild Bill Hickok, one of the West's most famous lawmen and gamblers, was killed on August 2, 1876, while playing poker in Deadwood, Dakota Territory. At the time, he held a hand of aces and eights, a combination that later entered Western lore as the dead man's hand. Contrary to Hollywood portrayals, Jesse and Frank James were never cowboys. They grew up on a Missouri farm, and many of their activities, both lawful and unlawful, took place close to home. For the Plains tribes, the bison was central to survival, providing food, clothing, and tools. Yet between 1850 and 1895, Herds that once numbered around 50 million were reduced to fewer than 1,000. Overhunting by white settlers combined with commercial demand caused this dramatic decline. Henry Wells, co-founder of Wells Fargo and Company, is often associated with the Old West, but he never lived west of Buffalo, New York. The company's name and influence stretch far beyond his personal travels. Among friends, Jesse James carried the unusual nickname Dingus, though its origin remains unclear. Humorist Will Rogers once provided a memorable quip when asked if his ancestors had arrived on the Mayflower. "No," he replied, "but my relatives were here to meet them," highlighting his Cherokee heritage with wit. When outfitting the Lewis and Clark expedition, Meriwether Lewis packed 193 pounds of dried portable soup as a backup food source for times when fresh game was scarce. Though Lewis praised its nutritional value, the men on the expedition reportedly disliked it, making it one of their least favorite rations. Henry Starr is often recognized as the last of the Old West outlaws to gain renown. Beginning his career in 1893, he led gangs of mounted robbers for more than 25 years. His long career came to an end in February 1921 during an attempted bank robbery in Harrison, Arkansas. During the frontier years, men skilled with firearms were given a variety of nicknames, including leather slapper, gun fanner, gun trapper, bad medicine, curly wolf, and shootist. The invention of the telephone in 1876 quickly made its way west. Remarkably, after the White House, the first community in the nation to have a telephone system was Deadwood, South Dakota. Contemporaries of Wild Bill Hickok often recalled his remarkable marksmanship. Eyewitnesses claimed he could hit a dime tossed in the air 9 times out of 10, or split an apple from a tree and strike it again before it touched the ground, all from a distance of 25 paces. On cattle drives, the typical cowboy could expect to earn between $25 and $40 a month. A trail boss who carried much greater responsibility might make as much as $125 monthly. When the Spanish conquistadors arrived in the Americas, they brought more than horses and Christianity. They also introduced European diseases such as measles and cholera. These illnesses devastated native populations. In New Spain, the number of indigenous people dropped from about 11 million in 1520 to roughly 6.5 million by the 1550s, marking one of history's most tragic demographic shifts. Judge Roy Bean, often remembered as the law west of the Pecos, ran for re-election every 2 years. He generally won, except in 1886 and 1896. By 1898, stories tell that he stood outside the polls with a shotgun, more as a show of force than anything, while informally gauging voter preferences to secure another term. Whiskey, a staple of frontier saloons, was known by countless colorful names. Among them were bottled courage, bug juice, coffin varnish, dynamite, firewater, gut warmer, joy juice, neck oil, nose paint, red eye, scamper juice, snake poison, tarantula juice, tonsil varnish, tornado juice, and wild mare's milk. These nicknames reflected both its popularity and its rough quality. Doc Holliday, one of the most famous figures of the Old West, once claimed that his life had been endangered on 9 separate occasions. Accounts say there were 4 failed attempts to hang him, and that he suffered 5 gunshot wounds during his turbulent years. William F. Buffalo Bill Cody received the Medal of Honor in 1872 for his service as a scout during the Indian Wars. However, in 1917, the year of his death, the award was rescinded because he had served as a civilian rather than a formal soldier. Decades later, the medal was restored to his record. Cowboys often gave humorous names to their food. Beans, for example, were jokingly called deceitful beans because of the noises they caused after being eaten, said to be talking behind your back. Calamity Jane became one of the most publicized women of the West, though her real life was more complicated than her legend. Historical accounts suggest she was often a camp follower, spent time in brothels, and in later years struggled heavily with alcohol. The phrase, "keep your ear to the ground," originated on the plains. Travelers and scouts would literally place an ear to the earth to detect the vibrations of approaching horses or wagons. Over time, the expression became a general warning to stay alert and attentive. The legendary gunfight at the OK Corral is somewhat misnamed. When the Earps and the Clantons clashed in Tombstone, Arizona in October 1881, the confrontation actually took place in a vacant lot between Fly's Photograph Gallery and the Harwood House on Fremont Street. The OK Corral was nearby, but over time its name became permanently linked with the event. The Lewis and Clark expedition, commissioned by President Thomas Jefferson, ultimately covered 7,789 miles. Jefferson initially estimated the journey would cost $2,500, but the true expense reached $38,722.25, reflecting both the scope and difficulty of the undertaking. In 1825, during the presidency of John Quincy Adams, the first indoor toilet was installed in the White House. The innovation sparked lively debate and numerous jokes, even giving rise to the slang term Quincy for an indoor toilet. While Wyatt Earp became famous for his role in Tombstone, his time in Dodge City saw relatively little bloodshed. In fact, only one man, George Hoyt, was ever killed in an exchange of gunfire with Earp there on July 26, 1878, after a drunken disturbance. Annie Oakley, born Phoebe Ann Mosey, became a celebrated sharpshooter and star of Buffalo Bill's Wild West show. Despite her fame as a Western icon, she never lived farther west than Ohio. Life in Deadwood, South Dakota, during its 1876 gold rush was rough and unbalanced. Reports from the time estimated that as many as 90% of women there were working as prostitutes, reflecting the transient and male-dominated population. Kit Carson, the well-known frontiersman, was described by relatives as fearless, dependable, and upright in character. As reliable as the sun coming up, man with morals as clean as a hound's tooth. The United States' first major gold rush was not in California in 1849, but in northern Georgia in 1828. This early rush gave rise to many of the mining terms later used across the West, such as bonanza, placer, gold belt, and gold region. On his first cattle drive to Colorado, Charles Goodnight devised one of the cowboys' most enduring innovations, the chuck wagon. By modifying an old Army surplus wagon, he created a mobile kitchen with compartments for bacon, beans, flour, coffee, spices, and even liquor. The chuck wagon soon became an indispensable part of trail life. After decades of service in law enforcement, Bill Tillman, retired U.S. Deputy Marshal and later Marshal of Cromwell, Oklahoma, met his end in 1924 at age 70. Ironically, after surviving the dangers of the Old West, he was killed by a corrupt prohibition officer, a reminder of how law and disorder carried into the 20th century. Between 1789 and 1850, the United States acquired more than 450 million acres of Native American land. The government paid approximately $490 million, averaging about $1.08 per acre, illustrating how vast tracts of land were absorbed into the young nation at minimal cost. George Armstrong Custer famously disregarded orders during the 1876 campaign, charging into what turned out to be one of the largest Native gatherings in American history. In less than 30 minutes, he and his command were overwhelmed in the event remembered as the Battle of the Little Bighorn. From 1875 to 1891, 65 U.S. deputy marshals lost their lives while enforcing the law under Judge Isaac C. Parker of Fort Smith, Arkansas. Their service reflects the high risks of law enforcement in the frontier territories. Henry Plummer, Sheriff of Bannock, Montana, led a double life. While sworn to uphold the law, he secretly headed a band of road agents responsible for numerous robberies and killings. In 1864, local vigilantes exposed his hidden activities and carried out swift frontier justice. During Deadwood's gold rush peak in 1876, the town gained a reputation for disorder, with reports suggesting it averaged one violent death per day. Meanwhile, in Billings, Montana, saloons showcased entertainment in their own way, with cowboys and dance hall women performing daring stunts atop bars, tables, and even pianos. Wyatt Earp's ventures extended far beyond Arizona. In the late 1890s, he operated a saloon in Nome, Alaska. One incident there reportedly ended with U.S. Marshal Albert Lowe disarming an intoxicated Earp after a heated exchange, an unusual episode for the once-feared lawman. Statistics on frontier gunmen reveal an important pattern. About one-third lived long enough to die of natural causes, often reaching around 70 years of age. Those who remained in lives of violence, however, faced shorter spans, with an average age of 35. Interestingly, those who turned to law enforcement roles tended to live longer than those who stayed in crime. The construction of the Transcontinental Railroad was another frontier milestone. Stretching 1,776 miles between Sacramento, California, and Omaha, Nebraska, it revolutionized travel and trade. On April 10, 1869, crews laid an astonishing 10 miles of track in a single day, a record that still stands in American railroading. The Battle of the Little Bighorn, often called Custer's Last Stand, took place on June 25, 1876. Lieutenant Colonel Custer and more than 200 of his men were surrounded and killed in under 20 minutes, a dramatic turning point in the Indian Wars that entered both Native and American memory. America's first recorded train robbery is generally believed to have occurred on October 6, 1855, in Jackson County, Indiana. Brothers John and Simeon Reno stopped the Ohio and Mississippi Railroad and took $13,000, marking the beginning of what became a recurring crime of the frontier era. While Lewis and Clark made their journey of exploration, they never knew that Spain had dispatched 4 expeditions between August 1804 and August 1805, 1,806, in an attempt to intercept them. Native groups opposed to Spanish interference turned those efforts back, but on the final mission, the Spanish came within 140 miles of the explorers in present-day Nebraska. Prostitution was long tolerated in Deadwood, South Dakota. It continued openly until October 1980, when the town's last brothel finally closed, ending an era that had lasted since the gold rush days. During the peak years of cattle drives, there were about 45,000 working cowboys on the ranges. Of these, roughly 5,000 were African American, an often overlooked fact that highlights the diversity of the frontier workforce. In Montana, 3 men who robbed an Adams Express car near Bannock were seized by local vigilantes and executed. Incidents like this were common in places where citizens, frustrated with courts they saw as ineffective, resorted to taking justice into their own hands. Between 1778 and 1871, the U.S. government signed 370 treaties with Native American tribes. After 1871, however, Congress ended treaty making, replacing it with acts of legislation, executive orders, and agreements, many of which were inconsistently enforced. One of the earliest cattle barons of the Southwest was not a rancher at all, but Jesuit missionary and explorer Father Eusebio Francisco Kino. Arriving in southern Arizona in 1687 to establish missions, Kino also introduced European livestock and taught methods of planting grain to sustain them, reshaping the region's agricultural practices. In Colfax County, New Mexico, Clay Allison once dined with a man named Chunk Colbert. According to lore, Colbert intended to ambush Allison during the meal, but events turned against him. Later, Allison supposedly remarked, "I didn't want to send him away on an empty stomach." While colorful, this story blends fact and legend, typical of frontier folklore. When Thomas Jefferson assumed the presidency in March 1801, 2/3 of Americans lived within 50 miles of the Atlantic Ocean, underscoring how concentrated the young nation still was along its eastern seaboard. Yellowstone National Park sits atop a vast volcanic system. Molten rock lies only 10 to 30 miles beneath the surface, creating more geysers and hot springs there than in any other place on Earth. California bandit Black Bart became famous for his unusual style. He worked alone, and even wore socks over his boots to avoid leaving clear tracks. His real name was Charles E. Bowles, and he gained the reputation of a gentleman outlaw. Known for his wit, he sometimes left short verses of poetry in emptied Wells Fargo strong boxes, puzzling the men who pursued him. By the 1600s, Beaver populations in Great Britain had disappeared, and they had become scarce across much of Europe. This shortage fueled strong demand for American beaver pelts, leading countless trappers to roam the rivers and mountains of the West in search of skins prized for hats and clothing. The practice of scalping is often linked with the frontier, but its roots are older. During the French and Indian War, General Edward Braddock offered British soldiers and their native allies a cash reward for French scalps. This bounty system encouraged the practice, which later persisted in frontier conflicts. Cattle drives moved slowly across the plains. Herds rarely traveled more than 10 to 12 miles in a single day, as cattle needed time to graze and rest. A drive from Texas to Montana could take as long as 5 months. Esam Dart, one of the few well-documented African-American gunmen of the Old West, met his end near Browns Hole, Colorado. He was tracked down by Tom Horn, a stock detective who had gained notoriety for his work against suspected rustlers. Following the Civil War, Chinese immigrants arrived in large numbers on the West Coast, often seeking opportunities in mining, railroads, and service industries. Sadly, they faced widespread discrimination. In cities like Denver, Colorado, and Missoula, Montana, anti-Chinese riots broke out, reflecting the intense prejudice of the period. The Pilgrims aboard the Mayflower landed at Plymouth, Massachusetts, not because it was their planned destination, but because they had run low on provisions, particularly beer and other vital supplies. Their original goal had been further south in Virginia. In 1881, writer Helen Hunt Jackson published A Century of Dishonor, one of the earliest and most detailed critiques of U.S. government policy toward Native Americans. Her book documented broken treaties, unfulfilled promises, and systemic mistreatment, shocking readers of the time and calling for reform. In the Old West, it became a curious practice to photograph outlaws after their deaths. These images were sometimes sold as souvenirs, fetching as much as $1, a significant sum at the time. The photos served both as proof of justice and as grim collectibles for the public. On September 30th, 1876, 23-year-old David Davy Crockett, a relative of the famous Alamo hero, was killed in Cimarron, New Mexico, by Sheriff Reinhardt and others during a street altercation. Harry Tracy, often described as the last of the Wild Bunch riders, escaped prison in 1902. He was eventually cornered on a ranch in Oregon. Rather than return to prison, he chose to end his own life. His body was later displayed publicly, still holding his revolver, which added to his enduring legend. In 1873, more than 750,000 buffalo hides were shipped from Dodge City, Kansas, reflecting the height of the commercial buffalo trade that nearly brought the great herds to extinction. Body, California gained a notorious reputation as one of the roughest mining camps of the Old West. Accounts tell of disputes that escalated over trivial matters, a pool game gone wrong, an argument over a drink, or even someone stepping on another's toe. The town's women were equally strong-willed. A school teacher once whipped a local doctor for spreading gossip, and Madame Mustache, a well-known card player, famously defended her winnings against two would-be thieves. George Maladin, who served as the executioner under Judge Isaac Parker in Fort Smith, Arkansas, carried out more than 80 hangings during his career. In retirement, he traveled through small towns, recounting his work to fascinated audiences, portraying himself as a man who had simply carried out the law. Pearl Hart, remembered as the Lady Bandit, carried out the last recorded stagecoach robbery in 1899. Her crime and subsequent trial drew widespread publicity, as female outlaws were a rarity in the Old West. In Deer Lodge, Montana, local lore recalls an evangelist who, frustrated by a snoring parishioner during his sermon, fired a warning shot overhead to wake the man, an example of the dramatic and colorful incidents that dotted frontier life. Jesse James, the most famous outlaw of his day, often relished his reputation. In one instance, after a train robbery, he handed the engineer a written account of the event, essentially his own press release, ensuring his deeds would be recorded exactly as he wanted them told. In Fort Benton, Montana, one cowboy insisted on riding his horse into the Grand Union Hotel and up to his room. When the hotel manager objected, the confrontation escalated into gunfire. The writer did not survive the incident, and later it was said that 14 bullets had been removed from his body. The Mountain Meadows Massacre of September 1857 remains one of the darkest chapters in Western history. About 140 immigrants traveling in a pioneer wagon train through Utah were attacked by followers of Mormon leader John D. Lee. The travelers were promised safety if they surrendered their property, but instead they were killed. It was not until 20 years later that Lee was formally charged as the leader of the atrocity. He was executed by firing squad on March 23, 1877. Though outlaws often projected fearlessness, many held a superstition about dying with their boots on. Some reportedly requested that their boots be removed before death, and others begged authorities not to let word reach their mothers that they had died with boots on. In Colorado City, Colorado, Eleanor Dumont, born in Paris and widely known as Minnie the Gambler, gained fame as a skilled card dealer. She demanded honesty at the tables, and when she caught a fellow dealer trying to cheat her partner, gambler Charlie Utter, she famously punished him with a horsewhip. Judge Isaac Parker of Fort Smith, Arkansas, often called the hanging judge, sentenced 156 men and 4 women to death during his career. However, none of the women were actually executed. Presidential commutations or Supreme Court rulings spared their lives. Of the men, 79 were hanged on the Fort Smith gallows. In one Colorado tale, a cowboy quarreled with a trapper over whether wildcats had long tails. The disagreement ended when the trapper demonstrated his point with his revolver. The coroner later remarked that anyone foolish enough to insult a hard-drinking frontiersman had effectively died of ignorance. On August 21, 1863, William Quantrill and his raiders attacked Lawrence, Kansas, in one of the bloodiest events of the Kansas-Missouri border conflicts that preceded the Civil War. More than 180 men and boys were killed, and much of the town was burned. Frank and Jesse James later followed Quantrill's methods during their own outlaw years. The death of Johnny Ringo in 1882 has long been debated. A coroner's statement assigned by 14 witnesses declared it a suicide. Newspapers of the time generally supported that conclusion, though rumors of foul play circulated. Historians still argue over whether Ringo died by his own hand or was murdered. Crazy Horse, the Lakota leader, was known for distinctive battle rituals. He sometimes painted lightning bolts and hailstone symbols on his body, tied the body of a hawk to his head, or wore a war bonnet decorated with buffalo horns and eagle feathers. On occasion, he draped himself in a red blanket like a cape, creating a striking and symbolic appearance before battle. In Wild Bill Hickok's era, Abilene, Kansas, saw near-daily disturbances involving firearms. One fracas in a local saloon reportedly began when a patron declined another's drink. Another erupted after a tipsy cowboy rode his horse onto a pool table. On cattle drives, the cook would park the chuck wagon with its tongue pointing north before turning in for the night. At daybreak, the trail boss used that orientation to set the herd's direction. When Thomas Jefferson dispatched Lewis and Clark, he still entertained the idea that large prehistoric animals might survive in unexplored western regions. At the start of the Mexican-American War, the regular U.S. Army numbered about 7,365, facing a Mexican force estimated around 32,000. Barbed wire, twisted wire set with space barbs, transformed the open range into enclosed pastures, and reshaped Western society and ranching economics. Illinois farmer Joseph F. Glidden received the key U.S. patent on November 24, 1874. With fencing, ranchers could separate herds and manage breeding. From the end of the Civil War to about 1890, roughly 10 million cattle were driven north from Texas. A well-known anecdote about John Wesley Hardin claims he was once awakened by loud snoring in a neighboring hotel room and discharged his revolver through the wall. Frontier lore often repeats the story, though it's recounted for its sensational color rather than as a model of conduct. Between 1789 and 1850, the U.S. acquired more than 450 million acres of indigenous land. Contemporary tallies often cite about $190 million in payments, roughly 42 cents per acre, though totals vary by which transactions and time frames are counted. The word gang did not commonly mean a group of criminals in American usage until around 1870. Earlier in the 1650s, it referred to a herd of animals, and by 1823 it was applied to cliques of corrupt politicians. Between 1841 and 1866, nearly 750,000 people made the wagon train journey from Missouri toward Oregon, braving long distances and difficult terrain in search of land and opportunity. The modern cowboy hat took shape in the 1860s, when New Jersey native John Batterson Stetson, spending time in Central City, Colorado for his health, spotted a need for a broad-brimmed, durable ranch hat. He opened a shop in Philadelphia and began producing hats under the Stetson name in 1865. By 1906, his factory employed about 3,500 workers and turned out roughly 2 million hats a year. Choctaw scholar and statesman Allen Wright coined the word Oklahoma, from Choctaw roots often translated as red people. The term entered official U.S. usage in 1890 with the creation of Oklahoma Territory, and later named the state formed in 1907. Unbeknownst to Lewis and Clark, Spain dispatched 4 expeditions between August 1804 and August 1806 to halt their progress. Those parties were repeatedly turned back by native groups. On one attempt, they came within about 140 miles of the explorers in what is now Nebraska. On August 19, 1884, in Leadville, Colorado, John H., Doc Holliday, and bartender Billy Allen had a dispute reportedly over $5. Allen was injured in the arm, and the episode added another chapter to Holliday's turbulent reputation. The first biography of Billy the Kid appeared astonishingly fast, within 3 weeks of his death, helping to cement his legend almost immediately. Contrary to popular imagery, most working cowboys did not ride into trail towns firing their pistols. On cattle drives, many didn't carry sidearms at all. A gun was cumbersome in the saddle and could spook horses and cattle. Frontier lore also tells of Clay Allison's visit to a dentist in Cheyenne. After the wrong molar was drilled, Allison reportedly yanked one of the dentist's teeth in retaliation. An incident cut short when the commotion drew people in from the street. After Jesse James's death, many assumed his widow had been left well off. In reality, the household's valuables amounted to a few firearms, some jewelry of questionable provenance, and keepsakes. Z. James ultimately sold most belongings to satisfy creditors. Big-nosed George Parrott, who led a rustling outfit in Wyoming, was seized by a mob in Rawlins in 1881 and died extrajudicially. Afterward, physician John E. Osborne received the remains and infamously turned portions into curios, including a pair of shoes, a small bag, and a skullcap ashtray. Osborne later wore the shoes at his 1893 inauguration as Wyoming's governor. In the 1950s, additional remains attributed to Parrott were discovered in a whiskey barrel at the former site of Osborne's office. Today, the shoes and skull item are displayed at the Carbon County Museum in Rawlins. During the Oklahoma land runs, Sooner tales quickly became local folklore. One oft-told story claims that on the very first day, a settler was already tending onions 4 inches high, explaining with a wink that he had planted them just 15 minutes earlier, proof of how rich the soil was. When Thomas Jefferson took office in 1801, the United States counted 5,308,483 people. About 2/3 lived within 50 miles of the Atlantic coast, and roughly 1 in 5 residents was enslaved. With the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad, a cross-country journey from the East Coast to the West Coast could be made in about 8 days, an astonishing reduction from pre-railroad travel times. Despite its rough-and-tumble reputation, Tombstone, Arizona, recorded only 1 lynching. In 1884, after John Heath received a life sentence in the aftermath of the Bisbee killings, miners removed him from the jail and carried out an extrajudicial execution at First and Tough Nut Streets. On the treeless prairie, cow chips served as everyday fuel. Camp cooks relied on dried chips for a hot fire. The odor was unpleasant, but it didn't spoil the meal. One range cook joked he wore out 3 hats in a season, using them as bellows to coax damp chips to burn. In late 1849, frontiersman Christopher Kit Carson led a pursuit after the abduction of Mrs. J.M. White and her child from an emigrant caravan. Although Carson and a company from Taos caught up with the captors, Mrs. White had already lost her life. Nearby, Carson reportedly found a dime novel casting him as a solo hero against multiple foes, a striking contrast to the tragic reality. Judge Roy Bean became infamous for unorthodox rulings. In one discriminatory case, after pressure from friends of the accused, he browsed his law book and declared that while statutes addressed killing a fellow man, they did not explicitly cover the killing of a Chinese person. Then he dismissed the case. On September 6, 1870, 70-year-old Louisa Ann Swain cast a ballot in Laramie, Wyoming, becoming the first woman in the United States to vote in a public election. The Mormon handcart companies traveled between 1856 and 1860. In that four-year span, 2,962 Latter-day Saint immigrants pushed and pulled 655 handcarts roughly 1,300 miles to their new homes. In 1889, homesteaders Ellen Cattlecate, Watson, and James Averill were taken by cattlemen and executed without trial, allegedly for rustling. Later historical research indicates they were likely innocent, the targets of a smear tied to land and grazing disputes. The overland mail, most famously the Butterfield Line, carried passengers and letters between Missouri and California in about 24 days, knitting the continent together before the Transcontinental Railroad. The Texas Rangers trace organized routes to the 1820s and are among the oldest continuously operating state-level law enforcement organizations in the United States. The Old West was more than six-shooters and dusty trails. It was a world of invention, survival, and unforgettable characters who left their mark on American history. From unexpected cowboy traditions to surprising frontier innovations, these stories remind us that the truth is often stranger and far more fascinating than the Hollywood version. If you enjoyed uncovering these frontier facts and trivia, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you never miss another journey into the American Old West. And don't forget, leave a comment below sharing your favorite fact, or let us know what Old West mystery you'd like to explore next.